Hey everyone, Alex Williams here at the Open Source Summit EU in Amsterdam. We are doing our first homegrown live stream, I like to call it. This is the work of engineer Frederick Lardenois, aka Senior AI Editor for the New Stack. And I'm the first subject to do an interview. So I'm here with Christopher Robinson, and Christopher is the head of the Open Security Software Foundation. And the talk here is a lot about the Cyber Resiliency Act and how it affects engineers is my big question. And we were talking about Dan Feldman, who's the creator of the Curl project, and how it's affected him. And he really illustrated it quite well yesterday. I'm wondering if you could help us set up the problem right now. That's this, what is this existential crisis that faces the open source community that might not seem very visible, but it's there and present. And then we can get into some of the things how it affects engineers specifically.
So when you think about open source software, there's a lot of different reasons why somebody wants to contribute and kind of give up their creativity to the world. So if it's financial, a lot of it is, they have a problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah.
Almost never is it, I want to sell a product to somebody in Greenland or Australia or wherever. So what they're thinking about, I have this problem, so I'm going to write this application or this utility or framework or whatever it is. And they recognize that other people might have this same problem. So they give it up to the open source community. And ideally they get more contributors and people use it. And that they get a lot of pride and affirmation that their work is great. Well, a lot of manufacturers leverage open source. Depending on what study you read, I've read between 80 and 97% of commercial offerings contain substantial amounts of open source software. And that's, Sonatype and others constantly look at this every year. Well, with all this open source software, so these commercial entities, they're selling to customers, selling within different geopolitical regions. And these governments, whether it's the US or the EU or China or India, they will institute laws to protect their citizenry. Over the last few years, the European Union was working on legislation called the Cyber Resilience Act, or the CRA. And they were focused on protecting their citizens from cybersecurity incidents. So like Log4Shell, XZ utilities type things. They want to make sure that their citizens are protected and their data is kept safe. And they've put together a collection of cybersecurity requirements and have codified this into law that will be coming into effect both October 11th, 2026 for some of the reporting obligations, but then December 11th, 27 is when the law goes into full effect. And for a commercial enterprise, there are some fairly burdensome things they have to do and some very large consequences, like on the magnitude of billions of euros in fines and penalties if they're found negligent or they harm customers within the union.
So this could be like, let's say, a turbine company.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and they use open source software in the operation of their turbines.
Yes.
As they're developing new technologies, they need to report what they are building.
You're spot on. Like, what is the ingredients list that went into this turbine, or an application that a customer might have to monitor their power consumption or their heating or cooling? So you're spot on.
So that will be a lot of software that goes into the building of that turbine.
Yeah,
like the infrastructure to run the software.
Absolutely. And looking at like an average open source project has like on average around 160 dependencies. So the developer made this software and you've got so many lines of code, but then they have frameworks or SDKs or other dependencies that they're bringing in, so that the project you're using the sum is much greater than just what the developer did. And it's these manufacturers, it's the turbine company that has the obligation to the union to do the reporting, to make sure that they're compliant, they're doing secure by design, secure by default practices. It's not the upstream maintainer, it's not that engineer that's hacking away on the keyboard on their nights and weekends. Where what Daniel's keynote noted is that upstream very rarely has an understanding of how their software is actually used.
Right.
Again, they're looking at, I'm solving this problem.
Right.
Well, commercial enterprises will say, that's great. That helps me save engineering costs.
Right.
That helps me, lower my operating costs, whatever it is. And so they'll grab that and package it as part of their solution. And those commercial entities have some pretty strict requirements around like reporting of vulnerabilities and kind of documentation and process that upstream has no idea of, and they're not required to do. So what Daniel noted in his keynote is the constant pressure and requests and demand from downstream that he has no relationship to. He showcased letters from commercial lawyers, or different governmental agencies, demanding, give me your SBOM. Give me your market surveillance conformity assessment. And that's not necessarily the role of those engineers upstream.
Let's talk about the responsibilities of the engineer upstream.
Right.
Dan went through them pretty clearly. He might have to be responsible for a mailing list. He has to review all the contributions. He approves a pull request. He does, he writes a blog post. And he might, as he said, kind of jokingly, do some feature upgrades.
Right.
That's kind of stuff that people do all the time in these upstream engineering communities. And it seems to me that that's a great burden on them already.
It is.
And so what are your thinking about what the added burden will be to these people?
So legally, the burden is zero. Zero asterisks. There's certain situations.
But there is toil.
So in the law, they talk about an open source project is allowed to receive donations and grants, but they can't make a profit. They can only cover kind of their operating expenses. So that's kind of a gray area we're working with the commission to iron out.
Yeah.
But beyond those people that sell support or get donations or whatever, the normal upstream maintainer has no obligations. They may feel a civic duty or kind of a community duty that I want my software to be held in high regard and kind of has high quality, but there's no legal obligation for them. And as Daniel pointed out, and the majority of upstream projects are single maintainers. It's the Linux kernel, Kubernetes, the Apache projects. Those are the anomaly within open source, where you have a large security team, a big group of contributors. Daniel for curl is the maintainer. He has a lot of other contributors, but because you have that role, you're doing infrastructure maintenance, the blog, all these other stuff. And again, you're right. He was joking. Maybe I get to actually develop once in a while. Well, these downstream customers that have potentially billions of euros of penalties looming over them, they're not kind to these developers that are providing their work for free. They're threatening, demanding things like, give me your SBOM, give me your policy for security. And how do you do security events? What's your support lifecycle? And these are things that normally when you're upstream, you don't, in an enterprise, you'll have highly regulated, you'll have documentation, you'll have a lot of procedures. Upstream, most of these people contribute because you don't have those shackles. You can just be creative. And so you might not have these processes and documents that a commercial entity does.
So these engineers face people coming to them who have business problems.
Yes.
And the engineers have to think a little bit differently about the queries that they're getting because they're speaking to them in business terms.
Yes. Yeah. And that's been a historic challenge. I've been working with developers for 30 or so years, and they're an amazing group of people. They don't like to document. They generally don't enjoy process. And that's the type of things that these business people are kind of looking for.
Because the business people consider those open source developers almost as businesses themselves.
Right. Yeah, they have that misperception that this is like there's a corporation or some entity behind that. And it's a guy or gal in their free time mostly.
And isn't that the big gap right there? And that's a funding gap too.
It is also.
Can you talk about that funding gap? Because we talk all the time about funding open source developers, these single projects. But when you're talking about a business entity talking to an individual, there's no entity on the other side to support.
No.
So it becomes a very kind of complex way, because then it's like, well, do I incorporate myself as an LLC? But if I do that as an engineer, I'm facing my own liabilities.
Exactly. Well, and there's also additional cost. It's hassle. It's not related to developing and creating software.
So this gets to the heart of this issue we hear all the time about funding open source engineers.
Exactly. And that's why within the CRA law, they created this category called open source steward. And broadly, that equates to foundations like the Linux Foundation or Apache Eclipse, these other Rust, broadly. But there's some other people that can kind of qualify as a steward. But the creation of this role is to help encourage industry and nonprofit foundations to help support these developers. And funding, grants or donations are always welcome, but that's not the only way you could support.
But how do you fund them if they're individuals?
Sometimes you can't. They might, maybe they work at a university, so it's part of a university research study. So they're legally not allowed to take funding, and you have to go through some different path. But when we talk about funding, we look at it as several different paths forward, and money is always nice, but that's not the primary driver for upstream. But providing support infrastructure, giving them cloud credits so they can do tests, helping them write test harnesses.
Does there almost need to be like an open source financial institution that would then so if I'm an open source developer, I qualify to have an account, and my account gets supplemented based on my project and its size and all other criteria?
There are some groups doing this today. So within Germany, you had, it used to be called the Tech Sovereign Fund, and now they've transformed to the Tech Sovereign Agency. And the EU is considering making that use that model for an EU-wide Tech Sovereign Fund. But there are groups like GitHub has a means to sponsor developers. Our affiliated project, Alpha and Omega, helps fund projects, giving them tools or helping fund security experts to support those communities. There's a lot of different groups kind of thinking about this problem, but broadly, public sector has not effectively invested in helping support these folks that run the critical infrastructure of the world.
It's a very complex problem because of that difference in the difference between the entities.
Yeah,
and that really comes down to it.
It's a communication breakdown between business and engineers.
And so let's go back to the end of last year.
Sure.
The United States gets a new president.
I heard that.
Yes, he did. Yes, we did. We got this guy named, his first name is Donald, his last name's Trump. And I'm joking, of course. We know who Donald Trump is. But there was suddenly this rise in interest in digital sovereignty.
Yeah.
If it relates to Trump or not, we can't get into that really. But it did suddenly come to fore at KubeCon. I heard a lot of people talk about digital sovereignty and the open source architectures that really were needed to build out digital sovereign infrastructure. Does that play a role in this discussion about funding open source engineers, and how?
It does. And actually, the European Union has been talking about digital sovereignty for many years before it came up in the US.
But it's accelerated.
It's absolutely, they stomped down on the gas pedal.
Yeah.
Broadly, our perspective is open source is a global asset. We need to work, it's foundational to everything, whether it's your phone, it's a toy, it's your social media, however you interact with software and hardware. It's a digital public good. But certain areas of the world are looking to, increase their market share for their commercial entities. And it's kind of your patriotic duty. Like, I want to do my civic duty to help the region that I live in. So it's very compelling. But the trap from my perspective is, if you pivot too far that way, you create these silos, and we get back into 70s, 80s, 90s, where we had incompatible standards, and you erase all those efficiencies you've gained with open source. Open source, we're agile, we're fast, we're able to quickly find and fix problems and react to downstream feedback.
Right.
And if you silo these things, that you have just an Australia stack or a Greenland stack or a Brazil stack. You have these people that are working on the same problems, but they're doing it in isolation. They're not able to benefit from sharing and getting this feedback from this global community. So digital sovereignty is important, and you should try to groom the next generation of developers and try to make the manufacturers in your region strong and competitive. That's a great aspect. But we ask that we don't go back to this quagmire of all these silos. We would want to advocate for open standards, open protocols, open models, whatever it might be. Kind of keep the foundation open at the top, and then wherever you are, add your unique flavor, the special sauce that makes the French version of Kubernetes that much more amazing than whatever else might be upstream.
Yeah, the Bernays.
Right.
So
Yum.
I guess in conclusion, I would just like to ask if you could cite 3 recommendations you'd make to an open source engineer, someone who's maintaining a project or who's considering managing a project. What would what would you say?
That is actually pretty easy. So 3 items. First and foremost, we issued a free class teaching different personas about the CRA. It's a 90-minute class. If you're a developer, you only have to watch about 5 minutes of it because there isn't a lot in there for you. But if you want to, you can listen to the whole thing. But we also provide guidance and instructions for stewards and manufacturers. So take that class, educate yourself on what this law is about.
So number 1, educate yourself.
Educate yourself.
Right.
Secondarily, we have a project called the Open Source Project Security Baseline. It's a catalog of global compliance, whether it's law or it's a framework like the NIST SSDF, the Secure Software Development Framework. And we take these common application security practices, and then we map that to international regulation and cybersecurity frameworks. So take a look at the baseline. If you are able to fulfill some of those baseline requirements, you're ideally giving downstream what they need, and they won't bother you with letters from their lawyer. You can say, I understand that you want an SBOM. My SBOM exists in this Git repo. So things like the baseline, if you can do a little homework, a little pre-work ahead, you're going to save yourself aggravation like Daniel described yesterday.
Okay. And then the last one?
And then the last one, I love the fact that Europe created this steward role.
Right.
And the majority of open source projects are not affiliated with a foundation like LF or OpenSSF or Apache. So if you are concerned about regulations like this, phone a friend, potentially investigate finding a foundation that it meets your kind of philosophical goals. It's a community that can support you. Consider working with these foundations, these stewards, because generally these stewards have funding and they have the ability to do some of these enterprise type things that a single maintainer doesn't.
This is a big jump for a lot of people, isn't it?
It's huge. It's a real mind.
It really is. It is, and it also is a threat to open source because engineers haven't had to think about these things for them.
No. And ideally, again, if you align yourself with a steward or you follow these common AppSec practices, you are protecting you're shielding yourself from like the downstream nagging. And you're making better quality software. And like moving in with a steward, potentially, you're getting a much larger community. You might get additional contributions or people that you can get feedback from.
It's going to really change the character of the open source community.
I think so.
Yeah.
And EU isn't the only place thinking about this. We know that China and India and Korea now have all expressed an interest to do a similar type of legislation.
Big changes ahead for the open source world. Thank you so much, Chris.
You're very welcome, Alex.
Yeah.
Thank you.